That is the first elderflower of the year, and that means we're coming into winemaking season, which is a wonderful time of year. A lot of people, though, are quite worried about winemaking. They don't know what equipment to get. It's all got a lot of fancy terms. So today we're going to demystify all of that. We're going to explain the simple equipment that you need to make wine at home. We'll show you some cheap alternatives. And if you want to make wine this year, we'll show you everything you need to get going. Hello, welcome to English Country Life. Welcome to the garden with a bit of spotty spring sunshine around, but let's make the most of that. If we have to make a bolt for the kitchen to finish the video, I'll apologise now, but it's been a very wet old spring here. Welcome to getting started in home winemaking. Today we're going to go over all the equipment you need to make wine at home, and please don't be intimidated by that. Almost everything we're going to show today doesn't have to be purchased. You can make it, you can adapt it, you can use stuff that's widely available in your local supermarket. This should be a really cheap, simple hobby that anybody can do. And it's a great hobby. It can save you money, it's really social, it's very interesting, and even if you don't drink alcohol, you can make beautiful, wonderful vinegars from the end result. So let's get going and show you what you need and demystify this hobby. Winemaking breaks down into really four processes. There is, to start with, making the must, making the flavoured liquid. That's all must means, that you're going to ferment. And that's getting the taste out of the flowers or the fruit or the herbs or whatever you're using to flavour your wine. Step two then is to ferment that must. It basically turn any sugar into alcohol through the use of yeast. Step three, what we do is clear that wine. We've probably all had homebrew wine or beer that's some nasty, murky concoction that somebody inexpertly made. It shouldn't be like that. It should be crystal clear. It should be wonderful and far better than any commercial thing that you can buy because you put the time and effort into it. Step four, you've got to bottle your wine. It's that simple. Now in each step, I'm going to go through two parts of that step. I'm going to talk about equipment, your fermenting vessel, and I'm going to talk about consumables, the things that you use up in the winemaking process, the fruit, the yeast, the other stuff that you might want to use. If that feels a bit intimidating or a big investment at the end of the video, buy one of these. Buy a wine kit. Don't look down on wine kits. Honestly, God. Modern wine kits are superb if you get the good ones. And here's the thing. They produce a better quality of wine than your normal supermarket wines. And there's a good reason for that. And by the way, they produce them at a far lower price. In the UK, wine is taxed, and it's taxed heavily. So most of what you spend on a bottle of wine goes in tax. A lot of the rest goes in things like the wine bottles. Well, when you're making wine at home, you're reusing the bottles. You're not paying tax because what's in here hasn't been fermented yet. So legally, it's not wine. So the money you spend on a wine kit goes on quality ingredients, not on tax and throwing away glass bottles and corks. So you really can produce a fabulous wine for very little money. And most importantly, everything you need is in the box in terms of consumables. So the grape juice is in there, the yeast is in there, the yeast nutrient is in there, anything you need to clear the wine is in there, and so on and so on and so on. So honestly, when you get started, getting a wine kit is a great way of getting your confidence up, producing a really, really good bottle of wine at a very low cost. Right, let's get started. Let's look at making a must. The equipment for making your must, making your flavoured liquid you're going to make your wine out of, is really basic. You need a big, sort of 5-gallon-ish, 25, 23 litre sort of bucket, and it's got to be food grade plastic. And then you need something to stir it with. That's it. Now you can buy these proper fermentation buckets online. This is one by a company called Young's who make good stuff, and they are good, and I like them because the bucket needs a lid. You're going to be making your must over a matter of days. You don't want dust and insects and stuff getting into your must, so you want a nice clip-on lid. The reason I like these is they are sort of translucent, not necessarily transparent. You can see the liquid level in, and they have a scale on the outside. So when you're adding water or juice or whatever you're adding to make your wine, you can see how much you've added without having to carefully measure it out jugs worth at a time. So they're great, but if you're on a budget, here's my tip. Go and befriend your local baker, the guys that make donuts and cakes and stuff. A lot of the time, they get the icing for those in white, food grade, 5-gallon buckets. And for a smile and a thank you, they'll often give you a used one. And all you need to do is rinse out the sugar that was in it, and you're good to go. The other thing you need, something to stir it with. We use these wooden spoons, which we sell in our eBay shop, made by a wonderful guy called Alan Gale. And they're perfect because they're big enough that you can get right down to the bottom. They've got a nice little right angle, so you can get right into the side wall for stirring. Nothing gets stuck. They're superb. But again, if you're on a budget, what do? Well, when I was on a budget, what I did was I went to my local pound shop, I got a wooden broom handle, I cut it to the same length and sanded the edges. Made a perfectly good stirrer for homebrew wine, so it doesn't have to cost any money, or virtually no money at all. Honestly, a clean stick that you've peeled, if you're really on a budget, get the bark off it, just peel it down to raw wood and sand the edges, that'll do fine for stirring your wine. I'm surrounded by pills and powders and various things here. These are all things you can use when you're starting to make your wine, when you're making your must. None of it's complicated. In a couple of minutes, you'll understand it all. And you understand that most of it, honestly, you don't really need to spend any money. So, first things first, sterilise your equipment. That's important. Your bucket, your spoons, your airlocks, whatever you're going to use, need to be sterilised. If you're not, your wine can turn into vinegar if you've got something called acetobacteria in there, or you can also get all sorts of off flavours. Really, keep it clean, keep it sterile. You can buy fancy sterilising powders, and they work brilliantly. I'm not putting you off them, but plain unscented household bleach, about an egg cup full in your 5-gallon bucket, fill it with water, leave it for 15 minutes, put everything else you're going to use into it, your spoons and what have you, let it sterilise, wash it well, done. And it works absolutely fine. So that's sterilisation. Next thing, if you're making country wines, this is all that applies, doesn't matter for wine kits, you can get wild yeast on fruits and flowers, and sometimes that doesn't ferment the way you want it to. So some people choose to kill off that wild yeast and then reintroduce their own wine yeast. And to do that, use a product called Campden tablets. And you put one of these in the wine, you leave it for 24 hours, and that's killed off any wild yeast. That's all there is to it. Most of the time with country wines, if I'm honest, I don't think you need to use these, but some people like to, just to be safe. Nothing wrong with it, but not strictly necessary most of the time. The next bit doesn't even apply to flower wines, it only applies to fruit wines. Some fruits contain pectin, which is the gelling agent that makes your jam. Trouble is, it makes your wine cloudy. So if you're making a fruit wine, and this I do recommend you do, get something called pectolase or pectic enzyme. It's available on Amazon. We'll put links to all this in the description below the video. But, you know, homebrew shop, Amazon, lots of places you can get it. And what that does is break down the pectin and make sure your wine's not hazy when it's finished. Really worth doing on fruit wines, in my opinion. Next things that can be added to the must are tannin. Now, tannin is what you get in a strong cup of tea. It kind of gives you that coated tooth feeling, that sort of almost like, you know, slightly furry tongue feeling. And a little bit of it in wine is naturally present, often in grape skins, so we get used to the taste of it in wine. But obviously country wines with flowers and fruit don't naturally contain tannin. So you can go to your homebrew shop, you can buy wine tannin in a powder form, you can buy oak chips, and both of those will introduce tannin into the wine. Or you can do what I do, make a strong cup of black tea and put a few tablespoons of black tea into your wine, and that will have just the same effect. Next step, acid. Yeast likes a slightly acid environment. And again, with grape wines, that's kind of naturally present. With a lot of country wines, it isn't. So you need to introduce something. You can buy things like malic acid, tartaric acid, citric acid in powder forms that you can blend together or use singly to create that acid environment for your country wines. Or a bit of lemon juice will do the job quite well enough. Different recipes will call for different combinations of these ingredients, but I wanted to explain them all to you. And honestly, most of the time with some bleach, some tea, some lemon juice, you're absolutely fine. So we've talked about making the must. Now let's talk about fermentation. Fermentation is easy, honestly, it really, really is. Basically what you need is yeast, and yeast will turn whatever sugars are in your must, whether they be naturally present sugars in fruit or sugar you've added. The yeast eats the sugar and puts out alcohol. That's pretty much all there is to it. Yeast does need more than just sugar though. We've already talked about it needs a slightly acid environment. It also needs some other nutrients, and you can buy a yeast nutrient powder that you can add to your wine, and I think it's worth doing, particularly with flower wines that don't contain much in the way of nutrients. Now honestly, fruit wines, most of the time there's enough nutrients in the fruit that you don't need yeast nutrient. One thing I'm going to stress, people will say, well, can I use bread yeast? Well, yeah, you can. Yeah, it will ferment. Yes, the wine will taste like bread, and it will ferment to a very low alcohol level. There are various types of wine yeast. So this is a general purpose wine yeast. Normal wine will make it ferment out 12 to 14% alcohol. You can get specialist wine yeast like champagne yeast and various other types that are perfect for making individual red wines or making very strongly alcoholic wines in the case of a champagne yeast. 9 times out of 10 for country wines, general purpose wine yeast is fine. Buy it in a decent sized tub, you'll have enough for the whole year, trust me. When you start fermentation on a country wine, give it a couple of days to ferment in the bucket, because it'll often foam up very violently. Once that foam dies back, what you need to do is transfer it into a secondary fermenting vessel. More posh terms. You may have heard the word demijohn. That's a demijohn. Just a big glass vessel that holds 4.5 litres, 1 gallon, 6 bottles of wine, and you can ferment in it. They're great for making country wines. I use them all the time. I like glass ones. They're perfect for what we do, and they're obviously reusable again and again and again. Truthfully, if you go to yard sales, if you're in America, car boot sales in the UK, a lot of people give up winemaking. They get a craze for it. They're not like us. They don't sort of live the life, and they just get bored with the idea. And you can often get glass demijohns for 50 pence each, and I strongly recommend them. They're easy to clean. If you really can't get one and you really can't afford one, you can get a 5 litre water container from your supermarket and just adapt that. Often you can drill a hole in the cap to put some sort of airlock on. We'll talk about airlocks in a minute, but it's much the same size, does much the same thing. The thing is, it will get stained with your wine in there, and it's quite hard to get clean again. But if you've got one of those lying around anyway, why not? Okay, we mentioned airlocks. There's a thing called a vinegar fly. It's a little tiny, tiny, tiny black fly, and it's attracted by the smell of fermenting. And on its body, it carries a bacteria called the acetobacteria. And if acetobacteria gets into your wine, because the little vinegar fly is going to try and get in, it will turn your wine to vinegar. Now that can be great if you want to make vinegar. Not so good if you want to make wine. And to keep them out, you need usually a thing called an airlock. That's an airlock. It's a little S-bend of plastic tubing, and you half fill it with water. And the gas can force its way up through the bottom, through the liquid, and blop out the top in little bubbles of gas, and it corks tightly into your demijohn. And it works brilliantly because the little vinegar flies can't get through the liquid, but the gas can and get out. And that's pretty much why you put an airlock in. Honestly, you can do alternatives. So if you haven't got them, if you haven't got a demijohn, if you haven't got an airlock, if you're using something like this, I've come across 2 ways that work really well. You could very loosely put cotton wool in the neck of your secondary fermenter. And if you do that, again, it's too fine a mesh for the little vinegar flies to get through. The other way, which is really ingenious, is to stretch a balloon over the top, clamp it on with something like a cable tie, if you've got one, and poke a tiny, tiny, tiny little hole in the balloon. And what will happen is the gas will come out as it's fermenting, swell the balloon, but as it swells, that hole opens up a little bit and it lets the gas out. But the hole is too small for the vinegar fly to get in. So again, that's really, really clever. The last thing I'm going to suggest, if you're going to make a kit, it's all simple, it's going to work. Don't make 6 bottles at a time, because you're going to want to lay them down and let them improve in the bottle, and 6 bottles isn't enough. Get one of these. That's a demijohn. That's a carboy. That's the term for it. That holds 5 gallons or 30 bottles of wine. Really, for kit wine, I think that's the way to go. It's got a little hole in the top. Takes exactly the same airlock. Everything else is the same. The only difference is that is 5 times bigger than that. One last thing before fermentation. I'm going to do a separate video on this, but I just want to mention it while we're on the subject. This is used to measure the specific gravity before and after fermentation of wine. It's called a hydrometer. It's a floaty stick with a weight on the end, right, with a little scale printed on the side. And what you do, when your must is ready, but before you introduce the yeast, put a bit of the must in there and float your hydrometer, and it will give you a reading, and that reading will be affected by the amount of dissolved sugar in the wine. At the end of fermentation, you take another reading, and the difference between the two, with a little bit of calculation, can tell you how much alcohol has been created by fermentation. So if you're interested to know how strong your wine is, really the best way of doing it is a hydrometer and one of these little cylinders to float it in. There are other ways that are more technical, but honestly that's easy and accessible, and probably the best way for the home winemaker to measure the strength of their wine. Well, the weather's closing in, as it has been at all times in this spring, and actually this video is going to take a little bit longer. So what we're going to do is take a break there. So we've covered how to make that delicious must, that flavourful liquid that the wine is created from, and how to start fermentation. In part 2, what we're going to cover is how to clear that to a beautiful, sharp, shiny, crystal bright wine, and how to get it into the bottles. If you've enjoyed today's video, can you spare us 5 seconds? Give us a thumbs up down below. If you'd like to see more of this kind of winemaking, let us know in the comments. What is it that interests you? Do you want to see Elderberry wine? Would you like to see blackberry wine? Shall we make a wine kit and show how simple that is to do? You just tell us, we'll make those kind of videos. And if you want to see those videos and everything else we make, just hit that subscribe button, the bell next to it. You'll hit every time we upload new content. If you want to support the channel, do have a think about buying one of our ethical branded t-shirts. The link's in the description below, and it really helps us out. So thank you to everyone who's already bought one. Whatever you do, come back and see us soon. Take care.